Today on the show, we're going to be talking about both voodoo and a little bit later in the show, Santeria as well. You could argue that they are cousins of one another, particularly in the world of what we call syncretism in religion, religions that kind of cross-pollinate and borrow from one another. We'll tell you a lot about this. We've got terrific guests for you. In studio with me is Professor Leslie Demangle, Professor of Religious Studies and International Studies at Trinity here in Hartford, author of Faces of the Gods, Voodoo and Roman Catholicism in Haiti. Joining us by Skype is Soumya Haas, a writer, executive director, and founder of Headwaters/Delta Interfaith, as well as being a voodoo priestess, or Mambo. You'll hear me address her as Mambo during the show. I'm going to begin by just talking about how part, anyway, of the strictly Christian world processes this question of how to think and talk about this religious tradition of voodoo. You're going to hear a guy who actually at one point was appointed by now President Trump as the liaison for Christian policy during his 2016 campaign. His name is Frank Amadea of Touch Heaven Ministries. You're going to hear a clip of him talking about Haiti in 2011 after that devastating earthquake, and you'll hear him talk about what he thinks is part of the problem.
What do you foresee happening here in Haiti, and what has God spoken to your heart?
The redemption of the country has to be in the fathering of the country. It's a lack of a fathering spirit here.
Amen.
Needs to happen.
Amen.
The curse of voodoo that has taken away the fathering of this land.
Yeah.
At other times, this same man has talked about how his vision of aid to Haiti, even in a dire situation like that, would be conditional on a change in that religion. He says there's absolutely a heightened spiritual conflict between Christianity and voodoo since the quake. We would give food to the needy in the short term, but if they refuse to give up voodoo, I'm not sure we would continue to support them in the long term because we would want to perpetuate that practice. I just want to say that's very, very similar to the attitude of the Protestant church in Ireland towards Catholics during the famine. They would be fed. It was called taking soup. They would be fed if they would renounce Catholicism and join a different faith. So religious bullying didn't start just yesterday. It's been around for a while. But Leslie Demangle, it's a strange thing to hear that and to hear a pastor in that way set these two faiths at odds with one another as enemies, particularly because, we use that word syncretism at the beginning of the show. Voodoo is not a stranger to Christianity, quite the opposite, right?
No, that's correct. Voodoo actually is the word Vodou, V-O-D-O-U, comes from Benin in Africa, and the word actually means spirit. That's all it means. But the attitude of the pastor was, in fact, based on a story that was told during the time of the independence of Haiti when the slaves revolted against a white domination. And according to the story, the blacks just got together one night and then they sacrificed a pig, then they shared the blood in a cup, and then they vowed not to tell the secrets of this revolution. And so it's always been interpreted that by that particular ritual that Haitians had sold their souls to the devil. And so the whole notion of being a father or fathering Haitians has to do with the fact that evangelical pastors or missionaries have to come to Haiti to change people's beliefs in Vodou and to make Christians out of them. And that's where that comes from. But actually, the story that's told about the sacrifice is probably not true. It was just something that was part of Haitian folklore.
Well, I think also, just to get to the religious studies part of it, this is, my understanding of voodoo is that it is a religion that did represent from kind of a melding of the religions brought over from West Africa by slaves from what's now Benin or Togo or Nigeria or Ghana to the Caribbean, to the New World, and then fused with Christian religious practices that they encountered there.
No, that's correct. So that when the missionaries arrived in full force in the 17th century, they came and tried to convert the slaves to Christianity. By that time, all of the slaves that had come from different parts of Africa had actually synchronized their religions together. And when the missionaries arrived, well, the Catholicism was just simply included in Vodou theology. So that today what Vodou is, it's an intermixture of both Catholicism and Vodou at the same time. And it was done in a very clever way because, in fact, the Catholic saints of the church turned out to be Vodou spirits.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point to which to bring in Soumya Haas. Mambo, as we talk about those religious spirits, we have to explain a little bit about Loi. Is that how you say it? I have to work on my pronunciations here.
Loi.
Yeah.
So I just want to stress that I am able to represent New World Voodoo. Voodoo in Benin is different. I've traveled to Benin, and I'm working towards my initiation there, but I'm still very, very much a novice. And there are certainly differences in practices among all Voodoo communities, as you find with any religious faith. So if, for example, I use Christianity sort of as a metaphor and an analogy because it's something most listeners will be familiar with. So trying to sum up Christianity is difficult and impossible, and trying to sum up Voodoo is similarly difficult and impossible. But there certainly are some core beliefs and some similarities that we can talk about. So the Loi are the spirits, and in New World Voodoo, they're not quite considered gods, but it sort of depends. That's a gloss with translation, with cultural translation. So in my community in New Orleans, we consider them spirits. And part of the core beliefs of, I think, any Voodoo community is that there are two worlds that overlap. There is the world, the common world that everyone sees, the world sort of that we live in, what we could call objective reality. And then there is the world of the spirits. And those worlds are laid over each other, and the world of the spirits imbues itself into our world. So part of becoming a Voodoo practitioner, whether one is a practitioner, an initiate, or a priest or priestess, is cultivating relationships with these Loi. And there are many, many, many Loi. Often what you hear referred to as a Loi, say, I think the Gede, who are well known and unfortunately much represented and misrepresented in pop culture. The Gede they're depicted as skeletal, often wearing a top hat, smoking a cigar. So there isn't a Gede. When we say Gede, we are speaking of a family of spirits. So you could think of Gede as like a last name, and then each community, locality would have different Gede that they pay homage to. Right, and so some of these
Loi that I've seen anyway are very anthropomorphic in nature and in depiction. And so when we see pictures of Baron Samedi or somebody like Papa Legba, it looks very much like a person dresses like a person. It's not some wisp floating in the air. And my sense of, say, a Loi like Papa Lamdi is that, back to Professor Demong's point, that entity would have some kind of kinship with saints that the early Voodoo practitioners in the New World had encountered, right? People say maybe he's a little bit of Saint Peter plus Lazarus plus something else.
Yes, absolutely. And, today we definitely see that, Catholic imagery is used very often. I think most of the statues that I have on my altar, my personal altars, come from a Catholic source. But again, it's tricky because every community is a little different. So one community, may see their Ogu. Ogu is the warrior, one of the warrior spirits. Sometimes it's Saint George. Sometimes it's another saint because again, there are many Ogu.
Right.
but that imagery is powerful, and I think that most, all religions are a Venn diagram. We can't live in cultures alongside each other. However, unfortunately and painfully, we have come in contact with a particular culture, and I think voodoo has endured for a very, very long time. Back into prehistory, as far as we can tell. And it changes. Voodoo in Benin is changing, as any religion changes. And I think one of the I'm sorry, I hope you can't hear my dogs
There's a
barking in the
Loa
background.
talking to you in the background, I think.
Yeah, I apologize. So, I think that coming from, for lack of a better term, a Western perspective, we have to be really careful not to fix certain traditions in antiquity, and to think of them as static and unchanging. There's certainly elements that remain, but everything is evolving, everything is changing, and everything adapts.
I think this leads us very well to Professor Demong. Some of this evolution you can see pretty early in the history of the New World. Louis XIV passes the Code Noir in the 17th century. Explain what that is.
Well, the Code Noir occurred in 1685, and this was a law that was passed by the French Parliament, that missionaries should be sent to Haiti in order to be able, and also to Louisiana, by the way, because Louisiana was also a French colony. So it was to be sent to all the colonies, all the French colonies, to convert the slaves to Christianity. And that's what the Code Noir is about.
Right. And there's I sense anyway, maybe I'm projecting too much here, but I sense nervousness already in the Code Noir, that there's kind of a sense that there's an indigenous culture that's already bumping up against Catholicism, that maybe this Venn diagram that the Mambo is talking about is already beginning. Those circles are starting to touch a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because already there were some missionaries that had been there before, and therefore there had been this intermixture of what you call the syncretism that had already started. Mm-hmm. So in a way, this was a way of clearing this up so that the slaves then would become pure Christians, as they were, and pure Catholics. And so the law was quite strict, and it stated simply that a slave, an African who came as a slave into the Caribbean, into any of the French colonies, could not work on the plantations until they had spent 8 days doing catechism in the church, and it was after they had been baptized in the church that they could then become Catholics. But I want to go back to something that was said earlier about the saints. It is true that the saints are associated with Catholic saints, but rather that the Loas are associated with Catholic saints. But there is something else to consider also, is that each one of the Loas is really a family of Loas. And it's a series of manifestations. And therefore, every Loa has different personalities, different manifestations. And I refer to those as different faces. And each one of the faces represents a different character and a different characteristic of this particular one Loa. So when you say Gede, you're talking about a whole set of what we might refer to as Gedevis. So there are a whole set of them that are associated with different kinds of functions and different persona. In a way, you find that in a lot of religions. I mean, look at Hinduism. You could also see in Hinduism, sometimes the gods have two faces. There is only one side, and then you also have the other side. And to some extent, that even exists in Christianity, because you have God 1 in 3. And the other two are really, all three of them are faces of the same principle.
Mambo, one thing that I encounter a little bit in just trying to learn about this is that people who are involved in voodoo will say, yeah, it's a religion. It's also a way of life, right? It's also a culture. Yes. That in a way, for some of us who practice a religion mainly on Sundays and in a very specific place that's not our house, we may have a wrong idea about the degree to which voodoo, maybe with its emphasis on solving actual problems in life at times, is pretty much a 24/7 thing. Do I have that right?
Yes, and I think that, it comes down very much to, difficulties with terminology and the way that terminology gets into our heads and then shapes our view of reality. Again, for lack of a better term, I say, Western. The term religion is objectionable to people of different faiths. My birth tradition is Hindu, and you find a lot of pushback in the Hindu community about the term religion, because that is a term that came out of an Abrahamic understanding of human culture. And so to take that, Abrahamic idea and then try to overlay that terminology onto these very diverse cultures with their own understandings of reality is going to lead to trouble down the line. And I think very much in academia, there is, always everything, again, things are always changing and evolving, that there is a movement towards thinking very critically about that term religion. What is included, what is not included, and why? Why do we arbitrarily decide something is culture but not religion? What's the line there?
Right.
So as far as we understand religion, yes, voodoo is very much a religion, but often that pushback of practitioners saying, no, this is not a religion, this is a way of life, is a pushback, against religion as a term that has boundaries.
Right, and I think also, I don't know, Professor Demong, as I try to learn about it, it reminds me a little bit of Shintoism in the sense that in Japanese Shintoism, there's a real sense of engagement with spirits. You clap in order to get their attention at a shrine. You back away from that shrine so that when you're done, so that you don't turn your back to them and offend them. And one of my senses, Professor Demong, of the Loa is that this is not a passive relationship between believer and intermediary. Spiritual intermediary. You don't just sit there and pray to the Loa, right? You have more of an engagement with them.
That's correct, because the Loa, in fact, serves as a protector. It's the one that watches over somebody's life. And there are all sorts of things that people do to please the Loa, but also to establish a very personal, intimate kind of relationship with the spirit. And religion, voodoo is, in a sense, a way of life. There's no question about that. Because there are so many things that are associated with what you do if you're going to be a voodooist. You're going to eat certain meals at certain days. You're going to wear certain colors or not wear certain colors on certain days. There are things that you do that have to be associated with a particular Loa who is your protector Loa. And each person in the temple or the Hunfor could have different Loas that they themselves feel very close to. So it is a way of life. There is no question about that.
Mambo, I have to ask. You say your birth religion is Hindu. How did you get to where you are now? What was that path?
Well, it doesn't. It wasn't really a linear experience, so unfortunately, it doesn't make a great story. But I will try. My father is from India, and my mother is Caribbean. So although I was born and raised in the Midwest in Minnesota. And although my mother's family, as far as I know, did not sort of deliberately practice any Afro-Caribbean traditions, there was kind of an awareness there. My mother's not from the part of the Caribbean near Haiti, so the word voodoo was not something I had really heard, but there was kind of a familiarity with Caribbean culture and Caribbean spiritual practices. And also, growing up as a Hindu in the Midwest in the 1970s was very trying at times. My parents started one of the first yoga and meditation studios in the Twin Cities. And back then, yoga meditation was like devil worship. People were very afraid of it. And so I had to learn at a young age to, first of all, think critically and to engage with, the public, often with adults, about my faith tradition. Because of this, I'm very sensitive to what I absorb in pop culture or even in journalism about a faith or a practice that is not familiar to me. So I was vaguely aware of voodoo and vaguely aware that it probably wasn't being accurately represented. And then about less than a year after Katrina, I kind of randomly ended up in New Orleans as a tourist. And like most Americans, my encounter with Katrina was through the television. I had donated some money and honestly kind of forgotten about it. And I was very struck by the situation for the people of New Orleans. And I spent a lot of time just kind of walking and talking with people. And voodoo came up a few times, and I was very curious. So I bought a book, and the author, Sally Ann Glassman, who ended up becoming my mentor and initiator later on, I read her book. I was enthralled and very curious. And I looked online at other books about voodoo, and I realized I knew enough to know that I didn't know which books were accurately representing voodoo and which were sensationalized. So I contacted Sally Ann and I said, by email, I said, hey, I read your book and I want more. I don't know what to do next. So she recommended some books and we struck up a correspondence via email. She encouraged me to come to New Orleans to attend some ceremonies. I did, and something really lit up in me at that first ceremony. Some of it is very difficult to explain. It's like trying to explain falling in love.
Mm-hmm.
But some of it I can talk about in terms of what I saw in that ceremony. First of all, it was very level. Seeing women being prominent in a ceremony was extraordinary for me. And seeing that there's definitely people who are, kind of running the ceremony. But it's not like other faith traditions, not like Hinduism, not like the Christianity I'm familiar with, where there's like a priest who's sort of elevated, like physically and literally, and then people who are sort of taking part but are in more passive role. Like the ceremony was, everyone was the ceremony.
And I
Everyone
can
was
see,
taking part.
that democratic quality obviously has some appeal. Hey, I'm getting a signal, Mambo, from the producer that I've got to get to a break here. You've been hearing Soumya Haas, writer, executive director, and founder of Headwaters Delta Interfaith, and also a voodoo priestess, hence my address to her as Mambo. We're going to take a break. Thanks very much for this part of the conversation. I'll be back with more Professor Demangle, and since Mambo has pointed us in the direction of New Orleans, we will go there and talk about the very specific New Orleansian version of voodoo. All right, we're back. We're talking about voodoo and a little bit later about Santeria as well. In studio with me is Professor Leslie Demangle, who is a professor of religious studies and international studies at Trinity College in Hartford, author of Faces of the Gods, Voodoo and Roman Catholicism in Haiti. Joining us now also is Cody Roberts, assistant professor in history at Louisiana State University and the author of Voodoo and Power, The Politics of Religion in New Orleans, 1881 to 1940. But Professor Demangle, to get us to New Orleans, I think we have to finish up our conversation about Haitian colonialism. So we said that in the 17th century, Louis XIV just says, no, everybody's going to be Catholic, so just forget about all this other stuff. And we know how well that worked. Like many kings who try to command the tide, he couldn't stop the tide of people's belief. So by the 18th century, voodoo is an incredibly potent force in Haiti, leading to revolt.
Yes, that's precisely what happened. And voodoo had a very important role to play in the War of Independence and the revolution that began in 1791 and it ended up with Haiti's independence in 1804. So there was by the 19th century, obviously the religion had become a very important aspect of Haitian culture. But it really took root, particularly after the 1804, after Haiti's independence, because after the independence, Haiti had no contact, or virtually no contact, with the outside. And the reason is because other countries thought that blacks could not rule themselves. And therefore, for about 55 to 56 years, Haiti had virtually very little contact with the outside. And the contact actually did not take place until 1860. But many of the priests, the Catholic priests who were there in the colony and in the country in the 18th century, with the war, most of them were white priests, and they left the country. And during those 56 years, the churches were left without priests, and a lot of actually voodoo priests were the ones who did the masses and took care of the churches and the congregations. So that period of 56 years is a period that was very important in the history and development of the religion, and brought about then this interconnectedness, this closeness between Roman Catholicism and this syncretism, as we refer to it, between Roman Catholicism and Vodou.
So, Cody, we have this kind of almost Haitian diaspora, but one of the places the diaspora really goes, particularly after the revolt, is to New Orleans. And so what happens there? It's not just a complete, perfect transfer of Haitian voodoo to New Orleans, right? New Orleans exerts its own specific pull. So do you get essentially a different variant of the religion there?
Yeah, voodoo in New Orleans looks really different than what you would read about if you were studying Haiti. The historical context, by the time you get to the late 19th and early 20th century, has kind of infused voodoo in New Orleans. So all of the kind of racial and gender and economic politics of southern Louisiana become really influential in voodoo. And by the time you get to the early 20th century, whereas the Loa, the spirits that are so familiar to Haitian voodoo, by the time you get to the early 20th century, they're almost invisible in New Orleans. Whereas people tend to talk about for a long time, I think the literature's gotten a little better recently, but for a long time when people talked about the spirits in Haiti, they talked about the Catholic saints as kind of stand-ins, as a mask for the West African Loa. But in New Orleans, you get a much more complete fusion where people who are raised Catholic, raised Christian, they begin to think of the Loa as the saints, and they become one thing. And they stop talking about the West African deities at all, largely because in Jim Crow, Louisiana, everything African is bad. Everything black is bad. And so even though a lot of these people are of African descent, a lot of them are African American, they buy into those same notions. And so you see largely a dissipation of the kind of Africanness and the Haitianness of voodoo, and you get a much more American variant here in New Orleans.
Every religious movement needs its version of St. Paul, somebody to communicate it to a much wider audience. Cody, I sense that in New Orleans, one possible candidate for St. Paul is a person named Marie Laveau. Tell us about Marie Laveau.
Marie Laveau is probably the most famous voodoo priestess in New Orleans history. She's active in the 19th century. She dies in 1881. And she becomes kind of a myth and a legend after her death, with people writing about how powerful she was, kind of reading her racial and cultural identity as an Afro-Creole, a black person of French language descent, French education, and reading that identity onto voodoo. And so voodoo becomes kind of an Afro-Creole cultural phenomenon because people associated with the population that had been here before, which is largely French-speaking. By before, I mean before the Louisiana Purchase, before Louisiana becomes American. And Marie Laveau becomes the living embodiment of that, as this influential mover and shaker in the city, as someone who is looked at as kind of the face of power and the face of voodoo in this very particularly Afro-Creole aesthetic.
Professor DeMong, I'm going to ask you a question to which there may be no good answer. But, as we're describing this progress, and particularly the progress of voodoo into New Orleans, and because because religion is culture and culture is language, and these things are often, all intermingled, and because, in fact, voodoo is already in a Creole tongue, so it's naturally adapts to New Orleans quite well, and including to white adherents, not just black adherents. We're describing what is ordinarily the progress of a religion from an an obscure, marginalized sect to more of a mainstream practice. And if we look at some of the other 19th century religious movements in America, you can start with the Mormons, right? They're this completely denigrated, ostracized group of people, and now they run for president. That didn't happen with voodoo. In other words, voodoo never was assimilated at the same level. Is there a theory about why that would be the case?
Yeah, because voodoo is essentially more of a sort of a sectarian kind of organization. And by that I mean that a sect is an organization that's completely autonomous. It's not like a cell that only functions locally. And so the religion, Vodou as a faith, is really divided into various kinds of cells, and these cells are local. And there is no Vatican, there is no organization that's international or national that controls its dogmas and its rituals. The different kinds of rituals and dogmas are just simply performed or done in localities, and they develop quite independently of each other. And so the nature of the religion is completely different, and it's organized in a different way. In Haiti, about several years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was an attempt to establish an organization that would be therefore a national or international organization, and a pope was actually elected by a group of community or a group of voodoo priests. But that really never worked, because that really is not the nature of the religion at all. Nothing ever came out of that.
And Cody, I mean, it seems to me that New Orleans, as usual, is full of paradoxes this way. On the one hand, maybe it's the place where voodoo establishes itself within at least some white adherents. And as you say, there's a pretty smooth blend in some ways of Catholic practices and maybe even an erasure of some of the West African names. On the other hand, New Orleans is, as you say, part of a Jim Crow culture, a Reconstruction culture, where black culture, black practices are not exalted in any way. So I don't know. Can you describe? I mean, there seems to be a way in which voodoo found a place in New Orleans, including among white adherents who were still Southerners, who still had some of those same kind of Jim Crow attitudes. How is all of that possible?
I agree with Leslie that that a lot of this has to do with the kind of hierarchy and structure, or a lack thereof, in voodoo, because you don't have kind of central authority telling you what it means to belong to the religion, telling you what the religion has to be. Then it's very malleable, and it can become whatever adherents need it to be. And in New Orleans, I make an argument in my book that what unites voodoo practitioners in New Orleans isn't necessarily a racial heritage or a lineage back to Africa or Haiti. What unites them is this desire for power. And usually what you have are folks who feel like they're on the wrong side of a power imbalance, a racial power imbalance, a gender power imbalance, an economic power imbalance. And these people go to voodoo to kind of make up for that disadvantage. And so it attracts everyone in the city who feels like they're in their position. Sometimes it's women who have problems with a spouse who in early 20th century America would have complete power over them in the context of a relationship, and they want to balance that imbalance in power. You have people who are African American who feel themselves at the wrong end of the Jim Crow hierarchy, and so they go to voodoo to make up for their power imbalance vis-a-vis their white counterparts. And so this kind of thing, the same thing with people who are poor. And so voodoo is able to attract a huge cross-section in a very multicultural city like New Orleans. And so it becomes a real reflection of the cultural politics here in the city.
Now, we could do an hour on the next little part of this conversation very easily, and we're going to have to compress it quite a bit. But the other thing that happens eventually is that American popular culture starts telling a story about voodoo, a cartoonified story that doesn't bear much resemblance to the conversation we've been having here for the last 35 minutes. So as an example of this, and a pretty contemporary example of this, listen to the creative director of Universal Studios in Orlando promoting his upcoming voodoo horror attraction, Bayou of Blood.
Bayou of Blood, which is from a distance, when you're looking down at Central Park, it is a really great vista that you're able to see. It's our first take on voodoo. We've never really tackled that thematic before. And it's usually something we reserve for our Mardi Gras festivals, but this year we want to do it at Horror Nights. And I believe on the hour we'll do a human sacrifice up there, like you do.
All right, so Professor DeMong, obviously this is like, I don't know, representing Catholicism exclusively as a pedophilia movement. I mean, this depiction of this religion as a horror attraction with hourly human sacrifices. I don't know. How did we get to that point? How is it possible to take somebody's religion and treat it that way?
Oh, this is a complete distortion of the religion. There is no human sacrifice in voodoo, never has been at all. So it's a misconception. But historically, that started perhaps in Haiti, and it occurred sometime between 1914 and 1935. And that would have been the time that Americans troops invaded Haiti, and they occupied the country for during that period. And there were many soldiers, American soldiers, who were there and in the country, and were not did have very little to do, and they dreamt up a lot of things about a lot of ideas and about Haitian voodoo, and they had certain opinions, and many of these negative notions that they had of this religion, they put them in various novels that they wrote, and many of these novels ended up in New York and were turned into films. So this is all part of the imagination that has gone on for all of this time, and it became popular among whites in the United States and other whites in other parts of the world. But there has never been any human sacrifice in the religion, and there's never been any cannibalism or anything of the like that
or voodoo dolls,
or voodoo dolls for that matter. There's no such a thing as a voodoo doll. There's no such a thing as sticking pins in a voodoo doll to do another person in. I mean, I've done 30 years of field research in Haiti, and I've never seen a voodoo doll. That just simply don't exist. And I remember doing in my research mentioning this to one of the priests on purpose, but to see whether he knew about it. Well, he had never heard anything about this, so. That simply doesn't exist at all.
Cody Roberts, I'm wondering, in a world, in an America that's becoming more religiously pluralized, the efforts of President Trump notwithstanding, and maybe more comfortable with different religious traditions, and certainly if you live here in the Northeast and you don't know any Wiccans, you don't get out enough. There are people much more comfortable talking about religious practices that they have that aren't strictly within the Judeo-Christian circuit. Is there a way in which, particularly maybe down in the New Orleans area, voodoo is coming back out of the shadows a little bit and becoming something that people can feel more comfortable talking about?
Yeah, I think so. There are a lot of practitioners in the city who are very visible. They hold cultural festivals around All Hallows Eve that are very visible out in the street, and they invite anybody, passerbys, to participate. People in a very tourist area like the New Orleans French Quarter, and they're very excited to let people know what they're doing and know how they got involved and introduce folks to the religion in the most positive way possible. And I think that has a lot to do with kind of the way we feel about other cultures now in the U.S. as opposed to demonizing African-American cultural traditions. Or what are viewed as African-American cultural traditions. We've had a renaissance in the U.S., right, where people of African descent first start to reevaluate and value their own culture and their connections to other places in the African diaspora. And then that kind of cultural pride past your Marcus Garveys in the early 20th centuries and your Black Power movement in the late 20th century, where people start to value blackness, then it becomes, as African Americans start to value it, other folks start to value it once they see it treated with respect and treated as something that marks a contribution to the kind of cultural tapestry that is the U.S. And so you have all kinds of people now embracing voodoo who you might not traditionally associate with the religion. There's a cultural center here in the city run by a local white priestess who was initiated by a Haitian Mambo, and she's been practicing the religion in one form or another for decades.
Mm. Cody Roberts, we have to stop. I could talk about this for a lot longer. The book is Voodoo and Power, The Politics of Religion in New Orleans, 1881 to 1940. We're going to take a break. Professor Demong will stay with me. We will come back. We will talk about Santeria, a cousin, I think it's fair to say, of everything we've been talking about so far.
I tried voodoo for a while, but at $15 a session, it was getting really expensive, and I found a lot of the other women in my classes were really competitive. Wait, I may have voodoo and yoga mixed up in my mind. Today's show was produced by Josh Nalea and me, Kyone Wolf, with help from Amanda Fish and our interns Evan Sobel and Ashley Taylor. The part of Bill Curry was played by Clarence Williams III. On tomorrow's show, a tribute to sucking up. And now, back to Colin.
All right, so we've been talking about voodoo for the last 45 minutes or so. We're going to talk about, and none of us here, even Professor Demoncle, is necessarily a reigning expert in the world of Santeria, but we can talk about how it's depicted both in culture and in the news. And Katie Zvadsky, reporter for the Daily Beast and a contributor to Politico and New York Magazine and BuzzFeed, has also joined us for that. Before we get to Katie, Professor Demongle, you and I have both lived in Hartford for a really long time, worked in Hartford for a really long time. You work at Trinity, which is part of the Frog Hollow neighborhood, for as long as I've been in Hartford, which is my whole life pretty much, but certainly starting when I got out of college in the 1970s. I drive up and down Park Street, and I'd see things like Botanica Chango and stuff like that, and I would realize, just because of the courses that I took in college, that's probably connected somehow to Santeria. People think about Santeria, again, as like the movies have depicted it as like even worse than voodoo or something like that, and all kinds of ripped apart animals. Santeria is like another one of these very kind of daily problem-solving religious practices.
Yeah, and it's really a cousin to voodoo, actually, because the situation that brought the rise in Santeria is not that different from the situation that brought in the rise of voodoo. The fact that Santeria is really, just as voodoo is a syncretism of Roman Catholicism and African tradition. The main difference really is that the sources or the origins of both religions happen to be different. I mean, Santeria is essentially coming from Yoruba tradition in Nigeria, whereas the voodoo is coming from Benin and Congo and other such places, and some in Nigeria, but mostly from Benin and Congo. So that would make a big difference, and therefore the religions, the theologies would be different. As the Africans came from different parts of Africa, they brought in their religions with them, which was then intermixed with Roman Catholicism, and the result was different on either side, Santeria and voodoo. But Santeria is a very, very vibrant religion in the city of Hartford. And the reason is because there's a large Cuban and Puerto Rican community and some Dominicans as well in the city who practice these religions. Now, those botanicas that you speak about actually sell various kinds of ritual paraphernalia that people can use either in their homes or even in the temples to soothe their fears, to allay their stress, and so on. But most of these involve particular kinds of candles and things that they will use specifically on their persons in order to bring about certain desired results.
Right. So, Katie, first of all, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And this, I mean, I think for the public, they hear about Santeria two ways. One of them is there'll be some episode of Law and Order or something where something really horrible has happened, or they're watching television news, and the police will say, "Oh, well, we think this person we just arrested is involved in Santeria," right?
Right. So that's actually exactly what happened in Hartford about 2 years ago when the police arrested a man who they thought had stolen bones from a cemetery in Massachusetts. And they said that he was a Santeria practitioner and that it was like voodoo, but worse.
Right, and this has also happened in Bridgeport as well. I guess it's sort of an argument, Katie, in a way, for police having maybe some religious training, maybe doing some seminars with Professor DeMongle.
Absolutely. You know, I think the way in which we talk about religion in America is often very binary, very simplistic, and these kinds of syncretic religions like Santeria, like Palo Monte, like Voodoo, they really don't fit in as clearly as Judaism or Christianity. And understanding what the rituals mean is really a taller order for police.
Right. And, just back to you, Professor DeMongle, for a second. This is something we talked about a little bit earlier in the show, but it's worth emphasizing. And we could throw Espiritismo in here, too, which is sort of a Puerto Rican variant of some of the same stuff that we're talking about. One thing that you said earlier in the show, but it's worth mentioning again, particularly in connection with places we live, is these religions adapt themselves very well to their communities. So Santeria in Hartford probably exists in a way that sort of fits the needs of the enclaves that it's serving.
Yes, but not only that it would do that in Hartford, but in various parts of the city, you would find, for example, that the religion would be very malleable and that it would take a different form from one part of the city to the other. And people who actually belong to one temple can very easily go into another temple. And the attitude is, well, this is their way of doing it, and our way of doing it is different. There may not be that much difference or that many differences between them, but there are different differences nevertheless.
Katie, it also seems as though, certain defendants seem to be trying to get themselves out of trouble. People who've broken into crypts in Worcester or something and taken human remains, when they get caught, they go, oh, well, I do Santeria.
Right. Both of these things can be true. Being a member of a certain religious group doesn't preclude any of us from also being a criminal. I think the question here is, are these human remains being used in religious rituals, and is that really the best way to obtain the human remains that you're going to use for a religious ritual? And actually, my understanding is that many practitioners, not so much Santeria, because Santeria does not, in fact, actually often use human remains, but practitioners of Afro-Cuban religions like Palo Monte, what they will sometimes do is they will procure human remains from medical supply companies. And in that sense, you're not breaking into someone's crypt. You're not disrespecting another person's ancestors by disturbing their resting place. However, you're procuring what you need in a legal way, and you're able to get what you need. The trouble with that, however, is that experts will say that usually, traditionally, practitioners of these religions would want to have some kind of connection to the person whose bones they're using, to the person whose spirit you're calling upon. And when you're procuring bones from a medical supply company, that's unfortunately not possible.
Right, and I think the other part of this, we got a minute left, but Professor DeMongle, the television and movie and media prejudice is this kind of notion that all of these things will be used for dark and evil purposes as opposed to benign purposes, and that these religions, to the extent that it's possible to generalize them, there are people out in the woods waving live chickens around and decapitating them for evil means. The more that I know about voodoo and Santeria, the more I think, no, these are actually the more kind of daily, just the stuff of life religions. You have a cold that won't go away. You have problems with the man in your life or something. I mean, these are religions that kind of address that kind of stuff very well.
Yeah, they're very practical because these religions deal with practical issues of life. But, to think that these religions, people who practice these religions or go to cemetery and just dig up any grave is completely wrong. I mean, these people are not grave robbers. Mm-hmm. So it's a misconception and a distortion of the whole thing. But let me say something, since you mentioned chicken sacrifices. The sacrifices are done, why? Because you kill an animal because you're offering to the spirit the dearest thing that you can give to the spirit. And the second thing is, no part of the animal is actually wasted. It's all consumed.
We're going to have to stop there. I think we have a little Santeria type music that I'm hearing in the background here. That means the show's over. We've been so lucky to have Professor Leslie DeMong from Trinity College with us, author of The Faces of the Gods, Voodoo and Roman Catholicism in Haiti.